Hey guys, in this video, we're going to learn how to read input from the user in C++. So we already know that we can print out texts onto the screen by writing cout. This command prints something out. If we wanted to take input in from the user, then we could write cin. This is the command that we'll be using to read input from the user. So let me show you how we can read input from the user in C++. First, we will use cout to print out a label on the screen that prompts the user to enter input. So I can write something like enter a value. Now when I run this code, you can see that it prints out the text enter a value. This is where the user will enter the input and where we will read the input from. So one important thing to note is that whenever you take input, you have to store it in a variable. If not, the input that you take from the user will be lost. So always store the input in a variable. Depending on the kind of input that the user is going to enter, you can create the type of variable. I expect the user to enter an integer, so I will create an integer variable to store the input. I'll do this by writing int and then the variable name. Let's just call this variable x. Now this is the variable in which I'm going to store the input that I get from the user. Now on the next line, to assign the input that I take from the user to this variable, I will need to write cin, two angular brackets, but this time they faced towards cin instead of outside like over here. And then I'll just write x. This line of code assigns the input from the user to the variable x. Notice that when we want to output something, we use the command cout. And similarly, when we want to input something, we can use the command cin. Just remember to make sure to make these angular brackets point toward cin instead of outside. Now one last thing that I want to do is print out the input that the user enters. So to do this, I can just write cout, you entered, and then I can put two more angular brackets and write x, because x is the variable that stores the input that the user entered. So this line of code will return the input that the user entered. So let's run the code and test it out. When I run the code on the terminal, it asks me to enter a value because of this line of code. So I can enter an input as an integer. Let's say I enter 10. Then when I click on enter, it prints out you entered 10. This is because it takes 10 as the input, assigns it to the variable x through this line of code, and then through this line of code, it prints out you entered and then the input, which is 10. So this is how you can take input from the user in C++. It can be very useful.